Hi everybody, John Carver here. I want to share some thoughts with you on the dropouts that changed the world. You're going to be amazed how many people who didn't think that they could accomplish a whole lot changed the entire planet for thousands of years. Let me share a quick story. When he was 15 years old, Jack had a crazy idea. The story was he would create a diagnostic test for pancreatic cancer that was better than the tests developed by scientists or research labs or even billion-dollar corporations. So Jack wrote a proposal, the story says, to develop a better test. 199 research labs rejected him, 199. But then there was one lab at Johns Hopkins Hospital decided that they would agree to do business with this guy. So they found out that as a result of his creation, that he developed this test that was 100 times better and 26,000 times less expensive than the current test. So Jack and his invention will save tens of thousands of lives because he didn't stop at 199. How many times haven't you been discouraged to not want to continue pursuing something that you were trying to undertake in your own life? There's another story where it talks about Elizabeth Blackwell, who was rejected from 29 medical schools. Now, this is back in the 1800s, but she kept knocking on those doors until she was able to get into a college because she wanted to be a doctor. So there's a huge difference between how the ancient people lived in the Far East and how we live in the West. And oftentimes, if you read the scriptures or the Bible, you're going to look at it, if you're in the United States right now, you're going to look at it from a Western point of view. And today I want to share some thoughts with you that most people don't even know. Back about several thousand years ago, there was a school in the Jewish culture where young children would be taught how to remember certain parts of the scriptures, specifically the 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, these were really good kids. They were smart kids, and everybody wanted to be a teacher, a religious scholar in that culture. And every kid that was born in that culture would be put through this school until there came a time whether they could take it or whether they couldn't take it. So the rabbis of this time had a particular twist on the scriptures. And in that context, that twist or that interpretation was called a yoke, Y-O-K-E. Over in Matthew, the 11th chapter in the New Testament, Jesus talks about his yoke. And again, coming from the West, we don't really understand what that yoke is, but you'll see that momentarily. In this book, it says, Jesus said, "Come to me, all that are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." And let me just pause there for a second. The Old Testament is full of rules. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of rules that people had to abide by in order to be following the scriptures of that day. In fact, there's lots of people that still follow the Old Testament rules. So again, Jesus said, "Come to me, all that are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." He says, "Take my yoke," Y-O-K-E, "my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And you'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, coming from the West, that makes no sense at all. But to the East, those people that were born in that culture, the yoke of a teacher or the twist or the extra rules that a rabbi would place in his teaching could be very difficult to undertake. So Jesus was saying that, you know what, my yoke, my twist on the scriptures, my interpretation of what God was trying to say in the scriptures isn't really that hard. And that was a big threat to the religious people of that time. So there were times when these Jewish people, these teachers would dress in all these fancy clothes. In fact, there's also a text that paraphrases this whole concept. Let me share it. It says, "Now Jesus turned to talk to his students, and a large crowd was gathered around him. So the religious scholars and the Pharisees, who were the teachers of the law of the Old Testament back then, were competent teachers of God's law, the paraphrase says. He says, you won't go wrong in following their teachings on Moses, but be careful about following them. They talk a good line, but they don't live it. How many people have you know who maybe talk a good talk, but they don't live it? As it says, they don't take it in their hearts and live it out in their behavior. It's all spit and polish veneer, this paraphrase says in Matthew chapter 23. It goes on. It says, instead of giving you God's law as food and drink by which you can banquet on God, they package it in they package it in a bundle of rules, loading you down like pack animals. Again, we're talking about the yoke that the rabbis put on the people in their influence because it was very difficult to follow these rules. So they would add more rules to it. And Jesus was saying, that's not the way to do it. Again, he goes on, they seem to take pleasure in watching you stagger under these loads and wouldn't think of lifting a finger to help. Their lives are perpetual fashion shows and embroidered prayer shawls one day and flowery prayers the next day. They love to sit at the head table at church dinners and basking in the most prominent positions, preening their radiance and public flattery, receiving honorary degrees, and like to be called doctor and reverend. So this paraphrase of Matthew chapter 23 is illustrating how some religious people of that day just wanted to be seen. And Jesus was very clear in his style and his method of teaching people that it wasn't what you look like on the outside, it's who you are on the inside. It was very interesting over in several parts of the New Testament how Jesus was adamant about finding the students to follow him. Now, in that culture, it was up to young men who wanted to be a rabbi, who wanted to be a teacher, that they had to go find the rabbi where their yoke could be meshed with the student. That is, that there are a lot of teachers in that culture. And typically, you had to go, as a student, you had to go find the teacher in order to follow the teacher, learn from the teacher, and maybe you, if everything aligned properly, you could grow up to be a rabbi. That was the goal of that day. So it was like trying to apply for a college. You would go to different colleges and check out the details of the colleges. This is kind of like the same way it was back then. But it was very interesting that it was very important to find the right teacher for you because you had to find the teacher with the right yoke, with the right system, with the right interpretation of the scriptures that merged with yours. So it was interesting in that culture, in order for a rabbi to find the right student or the student to find the right instructor, the way they taught was in questions. And that's very different from here in the West. When you're in college or in high school, the teacher gets up and addresses you and tells you things. They load you down with a bunch of facts. In that culture, things were taught by questions. They would ask questions over and over again. So each rabbi had their own particular interpretation of this Torah, which is the part of the Old Testament, which would, again, they would call that their yoke. So taking on the yoke of this rabbi, whoever it was not an easy task, because in that culture, the student had to leave their father and their mother and their friends. However, the parents were delighted that their student, their son, would leave the family business in order to become a rabbi, to become a teacher. It was a great thing. It was a major event. It was a party. It was a celebration. But to learn from your teacher involved 100%. You had to jump in with all fours. Now, in that culture, you would follow your teacher everywhere. In fact, there's an ancient quote that says, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi," meaning that you followed your rabbi so close that whatever he did, meaning that you would walk so close to him, the dust from the ground would be up on your face all the time. So it wasn't necessarily that the teacher had all the answers, but you looked for the teacher that would best mesh with how you viewed the Old Testament. So it wasn't maybe Christ wasn't certainly interested in the talents or the skill sets, because if you stop and think about it, in the Old Testament, when Jesus went and followed and tried to help people and tried to impact people and do miracles and healings and all this stuff, that before he did most of that, he went after his disciples. He went to find disciples. Remember I said earlier that in that culture, the students would go for and find their instructors. In Jesus' case, he went and found his students. It was very interesting how Jesus did this. Now, what he did was he was walking on the seashore, at least half the time when he found his followers, his students. But more times than not, he found students that were engaged in occupations. Now, this kind of speaks volumes to me. Let me kind of broaden that lens a bit. Remember I said earlier that a parent's great joy in that culture was to have their child grow up to be a teacher or a student or to be hanging around a rabbi that would teach them everything they needed to know. Well, most of Jesus' disciples, in fact, all of Jesus' disciples, were not religious scholars or students at all, because you're going to find that in the New Testament that Jesus found them, at least half of them, fishing. Now that suggests to me that maybe they couldn't cut it as a student of a teacher. And that gives me a little bit of hope for some of us that may not be, how can I put it politely, that may not think of ourselves as the creme de la creme or the top of the top. Maybe that's not where you think you are. However, Jesus went after people that had flaws in their character. I mean, if you read the New Testament, you're going to see a couple of times where Jesus had to confront some of his students in a couple of different ways, whether these students were hotheads, maybe they were a little bit weak-willed. Some of them, in fact, you're going to, if you read it more in the New Testament, you're going to see how some of them rejected Jesus over time. So Jesus wasn't necessarily looking for people who had all the answers. He was looking for people who had a big heart. Now that gives you, I think, and me a little bit of hope. That sometimes you think and I think that we have to have all the answers. We think that maybe we have to be the best of the best before we can even potentially change the world in even a small way. But that's not how I see the Bible teaching me, at least, that Jesus chose to use people that were not all that. And we still talk about that. Let me share another story. Jack Canfield was rejected 144 times before he found a publisher for one of his first books called Chicken Soup for the Soul. When Jack told the publisher he wanted to sell 1.5 million books, in the first 18 months, the publisher laughed and said he'd be lucky to sell just 20,000 books. That first book sold more than 8 million copies in America and 10 million copies around the world. So Canfield's book brand is now a $1 billion brand. So Canfield's advice, he said, so the reality is that you just have to say, listen, I'm more committed to my vision than I'm committed to your doubt or my fear, and just go for it. I wonder how many times you haven't been tempted to give up on some of your hopes and dreams. And again, I go back to what I said earlier, that Jesus chose to choose students, to choose young men that we're still talking about 2,000 years later that were potentially rejected by the religious world of that time. That maybe the religious world didn't think that these young men, the 12 disciples, were good enough to hang around a rabbi, a teacher, because maybe they just couldn't cut it. So I really think that, being average and ordinary in a positive sense is not necessarily always a bad thing. Because if you have a heart that wants to serve people, that it really in reality doesn't matter that you may not have all the right intellect, or that maybe you were born on the wrong side of the tracks, or maybe that you didn't finish school, or maybe you didn't even go to college. That doesn't really matter, really, when it comes to making a difference in people's lives. I go back to what Christ said in the earlier part of the New Testament. He says, you who are weary, he says, and burdened, come to me and I'll give you rest. He said to take my yoke. Again, this is a big deal, because in that culture, you had to do so many things. There were so many rules that you had to follow. And for most people, that was near impossible to remember hundreds of rules. In fact, the Old Testament has quite a few stories where people would forget or not choose to honor certain rules, and some bad things really happened to them. I mean, really bad things. But Jesus said, you know what, my philosophy, my rule book is much smaller, much thinner. And really the bottom line of Christ's teaching was, you love people like you love yourself. You love God and love other people and make a difference in people's lives. Now, religion, you know it and I know it, can be a sacred cow. And Jesus always chose to really challenge that status quo. And that's where I am these days in my life. I'm, at least mentally, challenging what that status quo is religiously in the Christianity side of my life, that maybe it's much more simple than what maybe you've been taught or I've been taught. Seth Godin writes, leaders create a culture around their goal and involve others in that culture. Again, leaders create a culture around their goal and involve others in that culture. That's what Jesus did. Jesus went after people. He chose to recruit people that were thought less than what the other people around him were thought of. Because he could have certainly found people that graduated from the Rabbi school, or maybe they had gone through all the classes that they had to go through as kids, and they did very, very well. Jesus didn't choose to do that. He chose, again, people that were sometimes outcasts. He actually went after this guy named Levi, who some people call him Matthew. And Levi was pretty much hated in the culture because he worked indirectly and directly with the Roman government, and he was a tax collector, and he was a guy that would kind of siphon taxes off the top and pocket it. That's one of the people that Jesus said, I want you to follow me. He even picked a guy that was radical. I mean, he was out there, and he chose one of those guys too. He chose a guy that doubted. I mean, he had fear and anxiety. He chose a guy that was a hothead. He chose a couple of the guys were pretty smart, but again, they were not smart enough potentially to be in the rabbinic schools. So Jesus chose to choose people that would change the world in a way that maybe the smart people wouldn't do. I heard somebody say one time, and this certainly doesn't involve everybody, but he says some smart people don't get around to doing anything. Again, some smart people don't get around to doing anything, whereas those of us that maybe have an average IQ, maybe a little above average, maybe a little below average, are the ones who actually get up and do stuff and change the world in a big way. Now, remember, in this culture, every detail of the teacher's life was copied, including their walk and their talk and their mannerisms, and every place the rabbi went, the students went. They followed him everywhere. And you're going to find that in the New Testament, you're going to see up until the very end that Christ's disciples were with him constantly, all the time. Now, it was very interesting also over in Matthew 5 in the New Testament. Jesus expanded what the Old Testament said. Let me kind of share parts of that here today. In Matthew 5, starting in verse 21, it says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court.'" But listen to this. He kind of extends this point big time. He says, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court." Think about that. So it's not just actually doing something, shooting a person, stabbing a person, hurting a person, killing a person. he says that if you're just angry with somebody, that's wrong. Skip down to verse 27. It says, you have heard it well that you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust to her or for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Think about that. So Jesus was teaching not only the action of doing things wrong is a sin, but the thought or the desire to do bad things or sinful things is wrong. So it's not just the act, but it's the heart. It's the mindset. And so that extends this sin thing quite a bit more. Down to verse 33, it says, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but that you should fulfill your vows before the Lord. But I say to you, listen to this, make no oath or a promise at all, either heaven or to God. Because you know what, he says clearly in scriptures that we are to be liable for our words. And again, here it says that we're supposed to be, we're liable for our thoughts. He goes down in verse 38. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But again, Christ adds a PS to it. He says, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Oh, this is hard for me. I'll be flat out and honest with you. He goes on to say, he says, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. What? Again, whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to the other one also? That's a little bit where I struggle. Maybe you struggle with that too. But that's what Christ said. And by the way, that's what Christ lived. I don't have time to get into all that here. But he was able to allow things to happen to him in his life that he could have changed, but he chose not to. Down to verse 43 in Matthew 5. It says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, listen to this one, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Let me repeat that. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor. That's easy to do for most of us, right? And hate your enemy. That's pretty easy. But Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I'm not there yet. I'll tell you flat out. But that's what Jesus taught people to do. So he went beyond, way beyond what the Old Testament said you should do. He said that not only your actions can get you in trouble, but your thoughts can get you in trouble. So it's up to you and I, according to what Christ taught, is that we have to be mindful of our thoughts, because our thoughts can get us in big trouble also. Over in Matthew, or rather Luke chapter 2, earlier in Christ's life, when he was a kid, there was a time when his parents and Jesus had to go into town to pay taxes. And they went with a big group of people from their hometown. And Jesus was about 12 years old at the time. And then they were halfway home and had to go back because they couldn't find Jesus. Because why? Because he was around the teachers asking questions and getting answers. Even at 12 years old, Jesus was adamant about learning from other people. And I think that's maybe a concept that you and I fail to remember sometimes, that maybe we should ask more questions. Maybe we should hang around people that can give us answers to our challenges and our problems that we would not have had answers to if we wouldn't been hanging around the right people. So the powerful questions can produce a mental turnaround in your life. There's been many times in my life where the questions that people ask me, not the statements, mind you, but the questions that people ask me has given me a total mind shift on what I'm doing and why I'm trying to accomplish certain things. Because sometimes you and I don't hear very well, in the sense of we don't want to hear certain information. But if people ask us questions, then that opens up our heart and our mind in a way that can literally transform our lives in a dramatic way. So when you come across situations in your life, remember that Jesus chose people that were potentially not good enough to be chosen by another rabbi. He chose people that had a work ethic. And sometimes a work ethic is better than maybe having a degree. Maybe work ethic is better than having all the intelligence that the super smart people had. That's what Jesus was going after. He was going after a group of people that were adamant about getting stuff done, who in time learned how to care about people. And again, I'll repeat it again, that we're still talking about these students, these 12 disciples actually, some 2,000 years later, because Jesus chose to go after the underdogs. Again, I don't have time to get into it at all here today, or at least much more, but Jesus chose to make a difference in people's lives that were ignored by the populace of the time, especially by the religious folk, because the religious people, again, at least most of them in that culture, wanted to hang around people with influence. Jesus didn't do that. He chose to hang around people who had zero influence, people who were sick and diseased and who were cast out by society, and who were told by others that they didn't have it, they weren't good enough. That's the kind of people that Jesus chose to hang around. And in time, those people impacted the world in a dramatic way. At least many of them did. So when you think that maybe that you don't have what it takes, maybe you think that maybe, there's no hope for me. But remember, Jesus chose the dropouts. He chose the underdogs. He chose the people that were absolutely on the other side of the tracks in order not only to change their lives, but in time, those waves chose to change people's lives in a way that we still don't know the details about. Because Jesus chose to step out and change and impact people's lives that were dropouts, underdogs, and rejected by everybody. So look around you, because if you look around you carefully, you're going to find people in your life that need what you have, that maybe if you don't give up on them, that you have hope in them, that you can change their lives in a dramatic way. My name is John Carver, and I thank you for watching.